filled the room up, it was working fine. It wasn't so many jackets, you know, and people dampening the sound. Can you hear me a little bit okay? All right, good. Hello, everyone. It was recommended that I introduce myself. It's been something apparently I just take off and start doing this thing. So, greetings. My name is Stephen Warren. I'm a board member of the Historical Society of Western Virginia, and I'm the volunteer coordinator for the Kegley lecture series. And so what that's given me a chance to do is interact with speakers and historians in the area and the region, and also it gives me a chance to honor the late George Kegley, who was a friend of all of ours. I got to know him when I was on the board the first go-round, and I went to a bunch of his lectures, and when I got back on the board, there was a vacancy in doing these lectures. George had passed, but also the pandemic had made us all out of practice for lectures and presentations out in the wild. And so when they were looking for volunteers, I thought, well, I'd like to give that a shot, because I like history, I like lectures, but also I wanted to see where we could go with this. So if you know of any good leads, some of the best leads come from audience members, speakers, people, friends who have written a history book, local interest, regional interest, or otherwise, let me know. And so the way you get in touch with me to do that is to contact the museum office, or just the museum, and talk to Kelly or Ashley. And so, and they give me the referrals, and I follow up on them. So that's that. Hope everybody's doing well tonight. Good to see you here. Good to see people here. We had a lecture last month that the weather pretty much put the kibosh on. It was a really rough night, and we were down in the dungeon over there. This is a room that lost its heating system a couple months back, and so the church said, we've got some bad news. You're not going to be able to meet up here, but the good news is you can meet downstairs if you'd like to. So we did, but it was a little tricky, particularly on a wet, rainy, cold night with no lighting out there to find our signs to point you in that lower door there. But we had a good speaker last month, just not a whole lot of folks were there, and so I'm really grateful to see everybody here tonight, especially, and I think you're going to enjoy tonight's speaker. We have Miss Mary Page Greene, a local author, who is going to bring her book, excerpts and stories about her book, Daddy Bear Goes to War. And this is about her grandfather's World War II chronicle, as well as his cartoons that he sent home. Now, before we get too far afield, I'm going to bring Ashley Webb up, who is our museum curator, and I'm going to let her talk a little bit about what's going on at the museum.
I'm Ashley Webb, and we have so much going on at the museum right now. It's the 20th anniversary of the Winston Link Museum, so we are going to be doing a lot of celebrating that. We have 3 new exhibits that are rotating in, plus a whole rotation of our Shenandoah Gallery, so bringing out some old favorites of the Link stuff, so make sure to come see that. Our millinery exhibit, which honors Sarah Earhart, is actually coming down at the end of this week. So if you have not seen the hats, please do come see that, because next week we'll start packing that up and shipping it back to our collection storage. So we have lots of stuff going on, so be sure to check out our web pages, subscribe to our email list, and yeah, I'm going to turn it back over to Stephen.
Okay. You're not going to let me sit down for long. Sarah, it's wonderful to see you. Just wave to everyone. We love Sarah, and if you don't know, we've named our collections pretty much after her, or rather a fund to tend to our collection after her. So if you care about archives and collections and Roanoke history, make a donation to the Sarah Earhart Fund. We call it a endowment, something like that. Well, we're honored. She was there, I don't know, you'll have to fill in the blanks with me, but forever. She was one of the stalwarts of the collections team for many, many years. I should say decades. And so whenever she had a spare moment, she was there. And when I was on, yeah. Now, Ashley left a few holes for me to fill. She's been painting. I'm surprised she didn't come here with spackle all over. We're repainting the galleries downstairs due to her efforts of securing a painter, and that's been sort of a interesting thing because the person's doing it in their spare time, and we're trying to save a buck here, folks. And the truth is, when, it's one thing happens after another, right? So I think she told me today that something went out. What system? The air conditioning?
It was the HVAC.
Yeah, the
HVAC.
Downstairs. And so, anyways, but she's been coming in and letting people. We're missing Kelly. Kelly took a walkabout to was it Scotland?
Ireland.
Ireland. Gosh, and for, I don't know, 3 months, I don't know what it was, some sort of sabbatical she took. And
2 weeks.
yeah, she's gone for 2 weeks, okay.
But it feels like 3 months, let me tell you.
But I mean, listen, that's how tight the staff is. I mean, if one person's out for a week. Well, last time it was Ashley decided to go to Tokyo or something, I don't know.
True story.
Yeah, yeah. Is that when you broke your arm too? No.
Yes, yeah.
So anyways, too much information, but we just, we're trying to get it all done. And so we've got the Kegley lecture series just to get everybody out of the house. And tonight, before tonight, we've got to tell you about next month and the months after that. We've got next month, these are all on the 4th Tuesday of the month here. And we've got Mary Bishop and Jordan Bell together under the same bill. Mary wrote the book on urban renewal. She was an award-winning journalist for the Roanoke Times and did this incredible article, almost 20 years ago, which led to a book of national significance called Root Shock that examined Roanoke, Pittsburgh, and one other, I think it was in New York, cities that experienced tremendous root shock, lifting communities up by its roots is what that refers to, and just like a plant in the garden. And so she wrote all of this information now for the first time so everybody could look at it. And along comes Jordan Bell in the last couple of years, who has family in the community. He grew up hearing the stories of displacement. And so he, in the most recent years, has been putting together these phenomenal tours of Gainsborough and the surrounding neighborhoods. And he knows all the family members and the names and all of the stories. So they're going to be here together next month in April. So please be here for that. The month after that, I can't believe we're lucky in this way. We had Nelson Harris back in the fall to do a makeup lecture for his book on the 1940s. In the meantime, he was about ready to go to press for his newest book on the 1950s. So if you've not been following what he's been doing, they're incredible books. They pick up where Barnes left off and give a weekly to monthly chronicle of news and happenings in Roanoke during these periods. And so he did the first decade was the 40s, and so now they're just about to roll off the press now. His book, I guess it's History Press or whatever, and so that's going to be the May speaking event for the Kegley Lecture Series, and he is going to donate all of his proceeds for sales of that book during that lecture here to the History Museum. Did I get all that right? Yeah. And so so when I heard his other book was about to come off the press, I said, Nelson, I've never imagined having the same speaker twice in one year, but I've got to be the first. So I want you to book us first before any other lecture series gets you. And so that'll be really cool. He did the last book. Wendy and I were there for his launch of that one. It was at the Harrison Museum, and he launched it right into the pandemic. I mean, it was the only he had all these speaking events lined up, and then the pandemic just shut everything down. So we went to that, and we got our copy of the book then. But so anyways, enough on that. That'll be for May. We take a break in the summer months for the Kegley Lecture Series, quote unquote. But we are going to, in honor of the Link at 20 celebration, we're going to have a summer Link at 20 lecture series at the Link Museum in the glorious refurbished passenger station with air conditioning And they're in probably got a name, but I'll call it the Link Auditorium. And so we've got 3 speakers lined up for June, July, and August, and they're all going to be related to the Norfolk and Western and O. Winston Link's photography. All right, that's enough. And the reason I'm taking this time is because Mary Page said her talk only goes for like 15 minutes. And 20, she said. And so, anyways, I got to know Mary Page several years ago when we were going through such a upside-down phase at the museum where we had to get everything straightened out in a hurry, and we had lost our bookkeeping and finance resource. I can't remember if it was what kind of position it was, or if we were getting it done through Center in the Square, but all of a sudden we needed someone with Mary Page's qualifications, and she took a shot at it. She said, I'll give it a go. I'm not sure it's for me, but I'll give it a go. And so for the next several months, we got to work together, and so I got to know her that way as a co-worker. I was a volunteer on the board at that time, and we were bringing her in to help us out. Ultimately, she decided it wasn't something she wanted to stay with, but she's always been around the museum and the Historical Society as a friend, and so we're glad to have her back tonight. I'm going to give you the formal stuff that she gave me because it's worth repeating. She's lived in Roanoke for over 50 years. She graduated from Roanoke College and taught in our area schools, and while her 2 children were in elementary school, she earned not like she didn't have enough to do, right? She goes and gets an MBA from Virginia Tech, and she worked in administration at North Cross School. When her children grew up and went off to college, she decided she still had some downtime. She was going to become a CPA, and she worked in public accounting for a while. And she's been involved in many community organizations throughout the years. She has roots, Mary Page has roots in the Roanoke area going back several hundred years. Her great-great-grandfather, William G. Hall, was a justice of the peace. Her great-grandfather, Harvey T. Hall, was the first attorney in Roanoke, and his firm evolved into what's present-day Woods Rogers Hazelgrove. In 2010, Mary Page became interested in learning about her paternal grandfather and World War II. As a result, she knows much more now about the war and her family's involvement in the development of our country. The process of researching, writing, publishing, and marketing a book has been another learning opportunity for this perpetual student. She is currently working on her next book, Marbury's Gold, which I'm told is of the Civil War era, and I'll let her talk about that. Help me welcome Mary Page Greene.
Thank you, Stephen, for inviting me to be part of the Kegley Lecture Series. And thank you all for coming and supporting me in this presentation. Please raise your hand if you've ever sent a parent off to fight in a war. A parent? Yes. Has anybody in the room sent a parent off to fight in a war?
My father did not fight in the war, but he was a Minuteman in Roanoke. And when the Germans sent prisoners over Roanoke, the Minutemen took charge of guarding these Germans. Well, 4 or 5 of them escaped. And out at the old Crumpacker Orchard, my dad was walking down through the field with his Browning automatic. Well, this buddy of his was hiding down in the way there. It was a dumb thing for him to do. So my dad was walking down there, and he jumps out, and Dad almost shot the guy. But anyway, that's my experience with it.
My father volunteered at 40. He was in Burma and India. And he ended up being in charge of 3 supply companies over there.
Okay. And he came back.
Yeah.
Okay. A little background of how I came to write this story. In 2010, I attended a discussion about the book Unbroken. It was about Lou Zamperini, an Olympic runner who was a prisoner of war in Japan during World War II. The Reverend Barclay Thompson opened the discussion with the statement, "I could never leave my family and fight in a war." I realized that is exactly what my grandfather did. I always lived far away from my grandparents and didn't see them often. My grandfather died when I was 11. I recalled some letters he had written during the war that my aunt brought to a family reunion. I wanted to get to know this man. It led me on a wonderful journey in which I learned about my grandfather, other family members, and United States history. I decided to write and share this story because it shows life during World War II. The love, loyalty, support, selflessness, and sacrifice by so many during that time. My book also includes about 50 of my grandfather's original cartoons, mostly drawn while he was serving in the war. My grandfather, James Francis Greene, was born in 1899 at a family home in Hamilton, Virginia, about 45 minutes west of Washington, D.C. He grew up in Georgetown, part of Washington, D.C. Jimmy loved animals and began drawing bears at an early age. He also seemed to develop a sense of right and wrong at an early age. He also, as shown in a note to his mother when he was 7 years old, "I did not take an apple to school after all, so I will eat it when I get home." Jim struggled with academics, but seemed to be of sound character. He was admitted to VMI and matriculated in 1917. After his first year, he was selected to be part of the Student Reserve Officer Training Corps and went to Plattsburgh, New York to train for World War I. The armistice was signed before his deployment, and he returned to VMI, graduating in 1922. Jim's extended family has been vacationing together at Rehoboth Beach, Delaware for over 100 years, continuing to this day. Throughout his life, he drew cartoons for his family and friends to celebrate many occasions. He had a generous, mischievous, fun-loving personality. Several years after graduating from VMI, my grandfather co-founded an advertising agency during the late 1920s in Washington, D.C. In 1928, Jim met my grandmother, Ann Smith, a teacher at Stewart Hall in Stanton, Virginia. She was from Danville and a Longwood College graduate. Their letter correspondence included many of his cartoons. They married in 1930 and had 3 children. Since the Revolutionary War, members of our family have fought for and defended this nation and democracy. At times, relatives were on opposite sides of the wars in which the country has engaged. They have helped create a balance of power in our government and promote equality among all people. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, Jim was 42 and Ann was 43. Their children were 10, 8, and 1. My father is the 8-year-old with a striped shirt. For 15 years, Jim helped expand the business and had clients in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, New York, and Boston. In addition, he had recently been asked to head the art department of Time magazine. For several years, Jim talked with family and friends particularly VMI alumni, knowledgeable about the war in Europe. His father-in-law, Edgar Smith, traveled between the United States and England. Edgar stayed in constant contact with his cousin, Nancy Astor, a member of Parliament in England. Julian Baber, his brother-in-law, worked for the Treasury Department, investigating counterfeit currency in Brazil. Hitler used this money to buy ammunitions in South America. Jim knew if England fell, it wouldn't take much for fighting to reach the U.S. mainland. With Ann's support, he offered his assistance, thinking he might train troops in North Carolina, coming home periodically to help raise his family and work in his business. This photograph was taken the day Daddy Bear left Washington, D.C. in May 1942. He took the train to North Carolina and was told to buy a train ticket to Texas. Jim trained troops at Shepherd Field near Wichita Falls, Texas, for the summer months in a desert-like environment. Due to a measles epidemic, he was not able to live in barracks. Jim did not have a car, so he was dependent on bus transportation or hitching a ride to get to the base. He rode a bicycle to carry out his responsibilities around Shepherd Field. The motto placed around the camp: the difficult will be done immediately. The impossible takes a little longer. After 6 months and a weekend stop in D.C. to visit family, he went to Miami, Florida for officer cadet school for 6 weeks. He passed the requirements, returned briefly to Texas, and back to Florida. His departure was delayed until his passport request was processed. Jim joked with Ann that he should have given his passport application to her as a secret messenger for Uncle Sam. At this time, Jim also learned that his company would not be able to pay him while he was away, as he wasn't generating income for the business. He and Ann had to adjust their family budget with captain's pay. In addition, Jim would have to pay $90 a month for his food throughout his service. He purchased his uniforms and paid for his transportation, and later was reimbursed for these expenses. This is the original drawing I suggested for the front cover. I think the publisher's artist did an excellent job of creating a 21st century rendition. I think Daddy Bear would have added color if a box of crayons were available. It depicts Jim in Africa while Ann and their children are celebrating the 4th of July in Washington, D.C. The cover art shows the boys fighting the war on the U.S. shore instead of setting off fireworks. Jim was part of a family who regularly got together. General Marshall, head of the Army and known for the Marshall Plan, and Admiral Lay, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the first 5-star admiral, were often part of the gatherings as they were extended family. President Roosevelt asked Admiral Lay to help him with the war effort after he retired at 70 years old. Ann commented in a letter after visiting him in the hospital, he had pneumonia. I'm afraid he's going to have to die for his country as much as any soldier who gets shot. It's a shame for a man who has given such splendid service and earned a well-deserved rest. Jim became an intelligence officer and after several stops in different countries, landed in the Middle East. He did intelligence work for England as well as the United States. He was a member of the Air Corps, part of the Army, which became the Air Force after the war. Jim was assigned to a heavy bombardment group and led led the troops during the hottest summer months 800 miles across Africa, retracing German General Rommel's retreat with all the dangerous threats left behind, such as landmines and contaminated water. He helped coordinate bombing missions in Sicily, Italy, and Southern Europe for 6 months from bases in Africa. One of the group's major battles took place on August 1st, 1943. The tidal wave mission, known as Black Sunday, sent 178 bombers to Eastern Europe to decimate the oil fields surrounding Ploesti, Romania. Nearly a third of the 1,726 men and 54 bombers who flew into hell failed to return. Another 440 returning men were injured, and only 33 planes were fit to fly the next day. After analyzing the destruction, it was determined within 30 minutes, a half an hour, the Axis lost 40% of its critical oil production facilities. This damage severely hampered Hitler's mobilization, and many historians believe it shortened the war by 6 months. While Jim was fighting the war, Anne was managing the bear den at home. She was raising 2 actively involved boys and a toddler while having to deal with gas and food rationing. In addition to Jim's previously mentioned expenses, sometimes the troops would be asked to buy war bonds to raise money for the war effort, basically to pay themselves. Jim would contribute as best he could, which meant Anne would have less cash to run the household, an added sacrifice on the home front. Another challenge for Anne was the drastic change of small Washington, D.C. The nation's capital became the U.S. headquarters for the war effort. Workers came from across the country to support the troops. The Pentagon was rapidly built in 6 months, along with necessary housing to accommodate the influx of personnel. Due to a constant fear of attack on D.C., blackouts meant no lights after dark. Citizens would patrol neighborhoods and fine residents if they did not comply. After Sicily and Italy fell, Jim's bombardment group, the Liberandos, moved to San Pancrazio, Italy, in the southern part between the heel and the toe of the boot. They stayed at that base for 18 months until the end of the war. Upon their arrival, it rained incessantly, such that the soldiers couldn't sleep in their tents. The group's main mission was, in addition to decimating the oil fields of Eastern Europe, was to destroy highways and bridges, airport runways, and munition plants with as little collateral damage and civilian deaths as possible. For example, prior to bombing the area surrounding Rome, they dropped flyers to warn the civilians of the impending attack, and the soldiers put flesh pots out so the bombardiers wouldn't hit the Vatican. The Liberandos' target hits percentages were some of the highest of any bombardment group, meaning they were within a couple thousand feet of their targets consistently. This accuracy was due to the detailed planning involved in preparing for the missions and the pilots' focus while being shot at while doing their jobs. Shortly after Jim's arrival in Italy, he received word that his best friend had died. Sam and Jim grew up together, went to VMI together, and were neighbors. Their children were playmates. Sam died while serving as a lawyer on General Patton's staff in the Middle East. Shortly before his death, Sam sent a letter to Jim's son in which he shares the experience of being in a battle. Those doggone tin hats are mighty handy for digging holes when you need a hole in a hurry. Patton doesn't believe in setting up headquarters way behind the scenes. His headquarters are a tank and expects his staff within yelling distance. This drawing is Jim's interpretation of a photograph of his family in the Washington Post. This scene was representative of about 5 million families' experience during the holidays. Fathers were missing. Daddy Bear was gone for 3 Christmases. Mothers had to fill the roles of both parents. He found some crayons. Jim expresses his love and desire to see his family throughout his letters with poems, words, and drawings. He is torn between his support for the cause, destroying the advancement of Hitler's evil, and being with his family. He never forgot that he had to do his best and not give in to his longing and sadness. Anne sent Jim several photographs of the child Jim was yet to know. He created a little book about her and looked forward to getting to know his daughter. He was going to have to wait. Upon returning to Washington, D.C., when the war ended in Europe in April 1945, Jim was asked to go to Japan. After a few weeks at home, he departed for Grand Island, Nebraska, to prepare for service in Japan. As his group was preparing for embarkation, the atomic bombs were dropped and the troops were sent home. Jim finally got to get to know his daughter and spend time with his sons. Anne and Jim celebrated 4 anniversaries apart. Jim was in Texas in 1942, Africa in 1943, Italy in 1944, and Nebraska in 1945. They stayed loyal and supported each other throughout this time. They are buried together at Arlington National Cemetery. Throughout Jim's service, he was willing to go wherever he was sent and do whatever he was asked to do. He trained troops in Texas. He went to Florida and struggled in the classroom. He believed that it was critical to put the most competent person in a given position, as it would save the greatest number of lives. He was an intelligence officer and led troops across Africa twice. Jim took the troops to Italy and became an executive officer of his heavy bombardment group. He helped plan missions and went on reconnaissance flights. He punished misbehavior, buried comrades, notified families, and constantly made life-changing decisions in a split second for soldiers. Most importantly, he encouraged and supported the men in his unit. He thought of different jobs he could do if there wasn't a place for him at the company he founded. After the bombs were dropped in Japan, the 376th Heavy Bombardment Group disbanded. Jim flew home from Grand Island, Nebraska on September 11, 1945, and reunited with his family. Thankfully, he was present in his teenage son's lives for a few years before they went off to college. He got to know his now 4-year-old daughter. He shared his experiences in a loving, story-like manner with his children. However, Jim did his best to put the past, full of hardship and loss, behind him and live in the present. Jim was able to go back to the advertising agency for 5 years. When the United States got involved in the Korean War in 1950, General Hershey asked him to help stateside. When Jim Jr. went to the Naval Academy and Bill entered VMI, young Ann and Jim moved to Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, so Jim could contribute in that war effort. In 1960, a heart attack forced him out of military service, and he and Ann returned to Washington, D.C. On April 4th, 1943, shortly after arriving in Africa, Jim agreed to fly with his tent mate as a replacement for an ailing bombardier on a Naples, Italy attack. He could have been kicked out of the Army for doing that, Air Corps for doing that. On their return, due to inclement weather, one of the planes, the Lady Be Good, lost its way and flew into the desert. The bomber made a soft landing after running out of gas. Jim led the unsuccessful search for the missing plane. 15 years later, in 1958, during an oil exploration trip, the intact remains of the Lady Be Good were sighted. The story of the Lady Be Good is an incredible example of the will to live and the means in which the soldiers tried to help rescuers find them. One of the soldiers, Sergeant Ripplesinger, walked 115 miles in the desert before he died. There was a movie made about that plane in 1958, that whole thing. Jim received 13 Bronze Service Stars for the numerous battles in which he participated, 3 Presidential Unit Citations, the highest unit decoration awarded, the Bronze Medal, the World War II Victory Medal, the American Campaign Medal, and the Air Force Longevity Medal. While he didn't have a military career per se, he served with distinction when the need arose. Jim was grateful to have served under the respected Allied leadership and its ingenuity. He knew how fortunate the United States was not to have to fight a war on its mainland, as his grandfathers had during the Civil War, and his many, many ancestors during the Revolutionary War. Most importantly, he knew future generations would have a chance to live with the freedoms he valued and appreciated. That's it.
We were talking beforehand, wondering, if we were short of questions, I would just make some up and keep things going. But I mean, there's probably a bunch of questions here. That was such a fascinating talk. My question is, what can you tie in anything about his experience with VMI to his sense of duty? Or, I mean, it sounds like he had his friends were already there, and here he's running an ad agency, and he just feels this calling. What did you find out about this?
Well, so when he took a semester off when he was at VMI, his second, so he went at 17. As soon as he turned 18, he went in the Service Corps to Plattsburgh to train to go for World War I. When he graduated from VMI, he wanted to go into the military, but after World War I, they really scaled back the military, and so it wasn't an option. When Pearl Harbor, he lived in Washington, D.C., and he and General Marshall were friends. I mean, he was in the world with people that were in the military. I mean, I told you, Admiral Lay and General Marshall are extended family, and so they were together all the time, every Sunday, actually, for family meals. And so he knew a lot about what was going on before Pearl Harbor was attacked. And his age group they all offered to help. Like his Dick Marshall, another relative, was a lawyer. He served in the Pacific as a lawyer. These people were super patriotic, and they left thriving careers to fight because they knew. I mean, you know, think about it, living in Washington, D.C., they were a little bit more privy to what was going on because, of course, Admiral A, General Marshall, Roosevelt, they were all there. And when my father was little, I mean, this is kind of a side, but it gives you a sense of how small Washington, D.C. was before World War II. After school, my father and his cousin would go over to the White House after school to see Admiral A. Hi, Granddaddy. I'm not kidding. That's how small town Washington, D.C. is.
Mary Page, I can remember as a child, blackouts here in Rome. I can remember rationing. If you go north on the Blue Ridge Parkway, we built a radar station up there. It has since been torn down. But just a little bit more history there. I mean, just go to the VMI Museum in Lexington, and you can spend all day in there.
Other questions?
I wondered, when you write a book, you always discover new things. In this case, say about your family, you know, your grandparents and so on. But what did you find out about yourself?
What did I find out about myself? How little I didn't know about World War II, how much I didn't know about U.S. history. My father didn't talk about his family, or else I wasn't paying attention. My grandparents lived in D.C. I never lived in D.C. I lived, while he was alive, I lived in Alabama, Delaware, 2 places in Florida, and New York. And I saw my grandparents maybe twice a year. I mean, I guess I learned how much I didn't know. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
You did a lot of
Good job.
research.
I understand that, but did you discover anything else about your sense of history, or, you know, aside from not knowing certain things, did you discover ways of looking at things that you hadn't done before?
Yeah, I think I did, a broader perspective. And partly that's because I got to know relatives I didn't know. And so I learned a lot about a lot of things that I just didn't know, and I was really quite amazed.
I was just going to add to that that was, I think, some of them, many of the veterans back then didn't want to talk about.
They did not talk.
I had a grandfather and his brother who both served in World War II, and we never talked about it, and they passed away in the 90s, and I regret never being able to ask them questions or hearing. I inherited some old photo albums, you know, a photo album that had some pictures, and that's all I could glean from that. So it's nice, it's really nice that you had, you know, some letters and enough information to write.
Well, my grandmother saved everything and made scrapbooks. And my aunt and my grandmother died in 1974. And my aunt kept everything. So she had literally all these letters in shoeboxes in 2010. And I said, may I borrow them? And she said, you may have him because you're the only grandchild who remembers your grandmother.
Can you talk a little bit about the cartoons? Were they his way of, I don't know, reaching the children in a way that that somehow cut through the horrors of what he was doing?
Well, first of all, very little could be said, very little information could be written in letters. And the service people, like my grandfather and the other soldiers, would have duty to censor letters. So they would read each other's letters and they would black everything out. So in some ways he was sort of telling what was going on by drawing, like the boat, that's a flood. And he did it in a cute way because to show the children, to take the edge off of the danger involved. My grandmother actually knew more about what was going on with my grandfather through reading the newspaper. And whenever anybody that knew my grandfather was coming through Washington, they would stop and see my grandmother and tell her all that he could.
Another question I have is that his background in advertising, you would have thought he would have been kept stateside in some sort of administrative PR function with public information or some sort of something on the war front, maybe selling bonds, you know, coming up with ad campaigns. He had a really diverse combat background.
I mean, I don't want to like brag, but my grandfather had the ability, and this is what other people told me, relatives and people knew. My grandfather had an incredible ability to bring out the best in people and encourage people to do things they couldn't do. And, you know, he was like, so he was in his 40s, and he was working in a heavy bombardment group. Most of those young people, most of the pilots were in their 20s, and he was a kind of a father figure, so he could, you know, be supportive, and he just had a real gift. He struggled with, it took him 5 years to get out of VMI. He really, I mean, I think he graduated like at the bottom of the class. He really had trouble with academics. He might have been dyslexic, I don't know, but he really was good at working with people. He read people really well. And so I think that he was in the right place, you know, training troops and then leading them across the desert and you know, being the executive officer is like the manager of the base. I mean, I think that was a good thing for him to do.
Any other questions?
I just have a small one. With your grandfather, when he went to war, did he volunteer for the position, or did someone come to him to say, hey, we think we could use you in this position? How did it get connected?
He volunteered. He probably offered to train troops, or the fact that he graduated from VMI and he had been trained for 6 months in Plattsburgh, New York for World War I. He had some background in training. And so they sent him to Texas for 6 months, I guess kind of get his feet wet. And then he had to go to officers' school in Miami. And actually, they were on, it's in the book, they were like at a golf course. And he talks about the kids who love being up here climbing the coconut trees. But he had a great sense of humor. Anyway, he really struggled with the academics in Miami. And that's where he says, you know, I don't want General Marshall, Admiral Lade put me somewhere because I'm their friend or relative. I want them to put me where I can do the best job and save the most lives.
Wow.
That's why I say he was emphatic about that when he was talking right to my grandmother in Washington. You know, If I need to stay stateside and train troops, fine, wherever they think I'm best, based on how I did in school, how I did at Shepherd Field, you know, they need to put me where I'm best suited.
So he could have stayed stateside with his safe job, but he's like, no, use me to the best of my ability with the troops elsewhere.
You know, I'm assuming that, I wasn't there, but
Wow.
that would be what I would assume. And he might, you know, I think he would, but he ended up going from Florida to South America, different places in Africa before he ended up in the Middle East. A cook's tour. You know, and he explains how he can't say where he is, because if he's with a certain general and somebody hears, oh, I saw a Greene XYZ, they'll know where that general is. They have to be really careful. And I guess it's like that.
I'll mention something real quick. I lived in New Orleans for about 10 years. When we were down there, they opened up the World War II Museum. And there's now like 5 buildings, including a hotel. But you can go online and they have all kinds of stuff that you can search about different areas. So if you want to find out about a specific area, more than likely you can find a video, or if somebody's telling a story about certain areas that might fill in some history about, you know, what your parents did.
What do you look up, what website would that be?
I'm sorry?
What website would that be?
At the World War II Museum.
In New Orleans.
Google World War II Museum.
Okay.
And
Thank you very much.
Who had a question here?
Well, my father was in the war and my mother was at home, but I was born after. And when you were talking about blackouts in Washington, that all made sense to me because we're a city government. And this gentleman over here talked about blackouts in Roanoke.
That's because of the railroad.
So I just wonder if these folks who lived through that could just talk a little bit more about how it was in the countryside. I mean, I can remember my mother talking about gas being rationing, but
I was a teenager. I saw the
Roanoke
bonds.
was because of the
And the
railroad.
arms. So
bonds.
stamps, defense stamps or something like that.
Right.
That's all I did.
But it was blacked out at night.
But at night, yeah, I would look like that.
Because we're not really that far from Washington if you're in an airplane.
Well, he's saying because of the railroad.
It was because of the
Yeah.
railroad.
Oh, because the railroad.
Yeah.
Okay, so this was a strategic place in its way.
Big time.
But say was, I'll just make it up, Durham, North Carolina, were they blacked out? I mean, they're not that.
Not unless they had some military importance.
Okay.
Good question.
Yeah.